Good morning, everyone. Today we have a special lecture at our Vinaya readings. We have Dr. Petra Kieffer-Pülz from Weimar in Germany. And Dr. Petra is a deputy professor of Indology in Halle. And she is also, one second, there is someone trying to join. She is also the leading let me get this right, head and research fellow of the project of the German Research Foundation called The Dispute Concerning the Legal Validity of Monastic Boundary in Balapitiya in 19th century Sri Lanka. That's in the Academy of Science and Literature in Mainz in Germany. I have added a link to Dr. Petra's academia.edu, where you will find many publications and that she has very generously shared. She is one of the greatest, most eminent Vinaya scholars of our time, and she has specialized in Sima. So she has very important publications on Sima, and more recently, or at least in the past decade or so, as I understand, she has been working on Wissenschaftliches Pali, that means scholastic Pali, and hopefully in the near future we will see the results of her work on scholastic Pali, that means commentarial Pali. And now I would not like to extend so much. I would just like to reiterate our gratefulness to Dr. Petra for teaching at SSBU online. This lecture will be a bit more than 40 minutes, and after that we'll have some time for questions and answers. So thank you very much, Petra, for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And yeah, thank you very much for attending the lecture. I now first try to bring my presentation to the screen so that you can see it. Okay, yeah. The title of my lecture is Translating a Vinaya Commentary, the Case of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī. Now, let me say a word concerning the title. Although the case I'm dealing with today is the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, which is a legal commentary, much of what I say also is relevant or true for any other commentary that you are going to translate. So it's nothing special for Vinaya. But since the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī is the example I'm dealing with, naturally it will be more on Vinaya today. Now, let me introduce you to the commentarial world of the Theravadins or of India as a whole, though you might know a lot about that. Now, commentaries serve the purpose of explaining texts and may contain observations on unusual vocabulary, difficult grammar, cultural context, relationships to other texts, and so on. So the explanation of text is a very old tradition in India, which originally was related to the effort of faithfully transmitting and correctly understanding the sacred Veda. In addition to the preservation of the wording, the exegesis of the Veda was of central importance. The explanatory means applied include, among others, grammatical morphological analysis and are still in use in commentaries of later times. In the 2nd century BC, explanation of text takes shape in the field of grammatical literature, with Katyayana's commenting additions to Panini's grammar, transmitted in Patanjali's Mahabhashya. In subsequent centuries, commentaries were written to a variety of genres, among them to sutra literature, shastras, epics, mahakavyas, and so on. According to an estimation of Ashok Aklutchkar, about 75% of the Sanskrit literature are commentaries. Jainism and Buddhism, which originated in the frame of the ascetic movements in about the 5th century, both produced a large quantity of commentarial literature. The Buddhist tradition split in a variety of schools, of which at least 2 have a rich commentarial tradition, namely the Mula Sarvastivadins in North India and the Theravada tradition in South and Southeast Asia. The commentaries of the Mula Sarvastivadins are nowadays for the most part preserved only in Tibetan translation, whereas that of the Theravadin are in Pali and a variety of vernaculars depending on the place of their origination. The Theravadin were originally split into a number of schools which transmitted their own canon, their own digest, and own commentaries. Of them, only the literature of the Mahavihara tradition has survived. The earliest layers of commentaries which the Theravadins have produced are in fact that early that they have become part of the canonical writings. This is valid for the Sutta Vibhanga, the old commentary to the Patimokkha, the list of rules for monks and Buddhist monks and nuns, which is contained in the Vinaya Pitaka. This is true for a fragment of a commentary to the Patimokkha introduction in the second part of the Vinaya, the Mahavagga, for a Suttanta in the Majjhima Nikaya, where the same verses are explained by 3 different persons, and for the Maha and Chula Nidesa, which form part of the Khuddaka Nikaya and comment on the Sutta Nipata, one of the older texts in the Khuddaka Nikaya. The next layer of commentaries are those brought to Sri Lanka by Ashoka's son Mahinda when Buddhism was introduced to Lanka. These commentaries were translated into Sinhalese, but they are lost today. In the first layer of Pali commentaries in the 5th century, the so-called Atthakatha layer, early Sinhalese commentaries have been used as sources. Whether or not they were the same as the ones brought to Sri Lanka by Mahinda is not verifiable. These Atthakatha commentaries were commented upon in sub-commentary literature designated as Tika. Further commentaries originated in later times in Thailand and Burma with a variety of designations. Since today I will speak in more detail about the translation of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, which belongs to the Atthakathas, we can leave these younger layers of commentaries aside. Now, what does a commentary explain? A commentary serves the purpose of explaining the root text. What a commentary explains differs depending on the purpose and intention of its author. If it is a commentary to a verse root text, the commentator often makes remarks concerning the meter and gives the sentences in the word order which correspond to the most common syntax in a prose text. In some workmanlike commentaries, not much more may be added. But naturally, such a commentary can contain all types of explanations also given in commentaries to prose root texts. Thus, the commentator might offer orthographical variants, grammatical, morphological analysis, synonyms for catchwords quoted from the root text, or etymological explanations. In the case of compounds, he might replace the single elements of a compound by synonyms, or he might take the words apart to show the nature of the compound, that is, whether he understands it as a dvandva, a tatpurusha, a bahuvrihi, and so on. The commentary may further explain things semantically, giving references to prove a stated meaning. For that purpose, the commentator might, in addition, compare completely different matters or add a kind of excursus, which is only loosely connected to the subject discussed in the root text, or add entire narratives, and so on. Some of the Vinaya commentators are very fond of taking Abhidhamma subjects for comparison. Depending on the commentarial type, the commentator might want to explain the content according to the opinion of the branch to which he belongs, or he might want to enumerate a number of differing opinions, or he might like to discuss the meaning in dialogue form by introducing an opponent who presents some opinion which he subsequently rejects. The latter is relatively late and certainly an influence from Sanskrit texts. We find it only in the Tika literature, not in the Atthakatha layer. In each case, the commentator might cite other texts or text passages to support his own or to reject the other's opinion. The purpose with which a commentary is written is essential for its type. Looking at the Vinaya commentaries on the Atthakatha level, we have the Samantha Pasadica, the commentary on the monastic law code, and the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, the commentary on the Patimokkha. The Samantha Pasadica is a kind of encyclopedic and problem-oriented commentary. This results from the fact that at the time of its compilation, monastic law was still applied in everyday usage, and that this usage was subject to change. Between the origination of the Vinaya and that of the Pali Atthakatha commentary, there are roughly 800 years of development of legal practices, which needed to be discussed and clarified. Different evaluations of monastic law in bygone centuries, which had been recorded in texts that might reflect regional deviations, were discussed as well. Thus, the aim of the Samantha Pasadica, though it explains single words of the root text, gives orthographic variants, etc., is to present different legal interpretations, not only the monastic law as understood by the author's tradition in 5th century Sri Lanka, but also that of the past 300 to 400 years, and even of branches deviating from the Mahavihara. Consequently, it also illuminates historical developments to a certain degree. In order to indicate which of the various interpretations was the one considered authoritative, the author of the Samantha Pasadica gives the authoritative opinion in the last place. Now, the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī comments on the Patimokkha. Since the Patimokkha is also contained in the Vinaya, there are thematic overlaps between the Samantha Pasadica and the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī. Unlike the author of the Samantha Pasadica, the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī author did not want to write an encyclopedic commentary, but a commentary which reflected the interpretation of the Patimokkha rules as established at his time and in his branch of the Mahavihara, and it was probably intended for practical usage. This is reflected by the fact that the commentator does not give a variety of opinions concerning legal questions, but in general only one interpretation, namely the one accepted at his time by his tradition. He also is not interested in quoting sources, and therefore we have only very few cases where he gives a source name at all. But most important, the author presents the material strictly arranged in the same way for each rule. As every commentator, the author of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī too reuses older commentaries. Among the different types of acknowledged and unacknowledged reuse, the method applied in the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī are unacknowledged borrowings which are changed, adapted, and supplemented. The text from which it borrows is the Samantha Pasadica. Samantha Pasadica and Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī are both assigned to Buddhaghosa by tradition. However that may be, it is clear that the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī is the younger of the two commentaries, and that its author is different from the author of the Samantha Pasadica because he uses a different technical vocabulary. He follows a different scheme of presenting the Patimokkha rules for nuns, and he offers a more concise and clearer classification system of the offenses against the Patimokkha rules. Now, what do we have to observe in translating a Vinaya commentary? Translating a commentary means to also translate the root text, since the commentator quotes catchwords from the root text, which he then explains. Translating the root text in this connection means that one has to translate it from the perspective of the commentator. Otherwise, it might happen that the commentator's explanation does not match the catchwords from the root text. In order to exactly translate a commentary, it is necessary to closely look at the quoted catchwords, their position in the sentence of the root text, and their meaning there. The main reason for this is that a commentary in explaining the catchwords mostly puts the explanation in the same cases in which the catchwords are used in the root text, and that often only parts of a larger unit are quoted, for instance, an attribute without reference word. As a second step, one should search the commentary one is going to translate for reused passages. In case of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, this means one has to search the Samantha Pasadica. Since the root text commented upon by the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī does not cover the subjects discussed in the Khandaka section of the Vinaya, the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī author has added an introduction to his commentary in which he deals with several important subjects such as the monastic boundary, sima, the performance of the observance day, uposatha, shared offenses, and so on. For that, he reuses portions from the Samantha Pasadica commentary on the Khandakas. The easiest way to ascertain whether or not a section is borrowed from the Samantha Pasadica is to search via the data bank as we have it in form of the Chatasangayana CD-ROM. Sometimes one has to do several searches since the wording in the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī does not always literally correspond to that of the Samantha Pasadica. Tracing parallels in the Samantha Pasadica mostly helps in understanding the often very concise Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, since the former is much more detailed and also contains many examples. If you look at the slide, you can see the page and line numbers in the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī in the beginning and end of the text, which is reused from the Samantha Pasadica. And on the right side, you can see from which parts they come, namely from the Khandaka section to the, from the commentary to the Mahavagga and to the Parivara in that case. And as you can see, in the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, for instance, on page 9, the first two lines are taken over from the Samantha Pasadica, and the next two lines are also taken over from the Samantha Pasadica, but there it's a little bit later in the text, and it's also not taken over so literally. So one really has to compare the two texts to really be aware what is taken over, what the author changed, and then one has to think about the reason why he changed. Independent of the field one is working in, what is most important is to be familiar with the technical vocabulary and its usage. To become familiar with the technical vocabulary, it is necessary to see what a word means in a given context. It does not suffice to look up a word in the available dictionaries because they often do not cover the word material of the younger texts. In addition, a Pali word may cover several related but different topics, and this may require that one translate it by a word that fits all these contexts. Therefore, one should check a word as used in legal texts via the data bank and look up all references in legal texts, starting with the canonical material, proceeding with the Atthakatha and then the Tika, in order to also take into account a possible chronological development of its meaning. Concerning the legal texts and commentaries, one should be aware that not only the two Tikas to the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī can be used, but also all other legal commentaries transmitted, since they all borrow from each other and from the Samantha Pasadica, which is the central text for all of them. In the following, I will give 3 examples from the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, which illustrate some of the things I just mentioned. My first example is connected with the verb tapiti and illuminates the importance of the knowledge of the technical vocabulary. The second example refers to the importance of differentiating between quotations from the root text, which are to be explained, and quotations used in the explanation. And the final example hints at a mismatch between the root text and the commentary. And my first example comes from the introduction of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī and stands in the context of the monastic boundary. It shows how essential it is to be familiar with the technical vocabulary and how important to not only translate the quoted word, but also its reference word, even when it is not quoted by the commentary. The text of the passage is on the left side, and on the right side I have given 2 translations. The first one is wrong to my opinion, and the second one is correct. So in the first translation, it goes as follows. One with unjoined markers is called with broken markers. The boundary ought to be established by announcing the marker in the eastern direction, in due order announcing a marker in the southern, western, and northern direction, and again counter-announcing the previous marker in the eastern direction. In the second translation goes as follows. A boundary with insufficient markers is said of a boundary with unconnected markers. Having announced the marker in the eastern direction, then having announced in due order the marker in the southern, western, and northern directions, and having again announced the marker first announced in the eastern direction, tapetum is suitable. I left tapetum for the moment. In the first translation, only the catchword kanda nimitta has been translated. without the reference word to which it belongs in the root text. Accordingly, we read one with unjoined markers. It is not clear for a reader what it is that has these unjoined markers. The word is an attribute to the word sima, monastic boundary, in the root text. Thus, a translation as a boundary with insufficient markers, as given in the second translation, is definitely clearer. Why I chose insufficient and not unjoined will be clarified in a moment. After this quotation, the commentator first explains Khandha nimitta by Aghatita nimitta. He has formed an identical compound, left the second element untouched, and replaced the ambiguous word Khandha by Aghatita. Khandha can mean broken, split, having gaps or breaks, defective or incomplete, or it can mean piece, part, and fragment, according to the Dictionary of Pali by Margaret Cohen, which is the most recent. So the word aghatita is the negative past participle of gatati and means unconnected. In the first translation, the translator has rendered Khandha nimitta as with unjoined markers, which coincides well with the explanation that the markers are unconnected. In the second translation, Khandha has been translated with insufficient, although this meaning is not given for Khandha in the dictionaries, and despite the fact that unjoined would correspond to the commentator's explanation here. The reason for this is that insufficient covers a wider field, which is necessary from the point of view of content, as we will see. But first, let us look at the rest of the text portion. In the first translation, we read, "The boundary ought to be established by announcing the mark in the eastern direction," and so on. Tapiti has been translated as "to establish," and an object not given in the Pali text, namely the boundary, has been added, probably because it is well known that the markers announced here are those of a monastic boundary. The verb tapiti, the causative of titati, means causes to stand, places, sets up, establishes, etc., or causes to stand still, to stop, and so on. As there are many more meanings, but these two are the main differences. So the meaning established is covered by the dictionaries. The problem, however, is that the verb tapiti is never used together with a sima that is to be determined with markers, neither in the canonical nor in the commentarial literature. In the Vinaya, the verb used to describe the determination of a sima is samanati, to agree upon, and in the commentarial literature, the verb most often used is bandhati, to bind. The latter is based on the method prescribed for announcing the markers of a sima, namely, in a manner which binds all markers to a closed circle. Thus, tapiti cannot mean to establish a boundary in this context. A look in the description of the announcement of the markers of a monastic boundary in the Samantha Pasadica elucidates the context. I quote it in translation. First, the markers are to be announced. What is the mark in the eastern direction? A mountain, sir. This mountain is the mark. In that manner, a mark is to be announced. What is the marker in the southeastern direction, in the southern direction, in the southwestern direction, in the western direction, in the northwestern direction, in the northern direction? Water, sir. This water is the mark. But without stopping here, atatva, only when having again announced the mark that has been announced first, thus, what is the mark in the eastern direction? A mountain, sir. This mountain is the mark. Is the announcement to be stopped? For in this manner, mark is connected with mark. In this passage, we have once atatva, the negative absolutive of titati, not staying or remaining there. That is, not stopping after the eighth marker had been announced. The reason is that the first announced marker has to be announced a second time in order to connect it to the last announced in the northeast. Only when this first mark in the eastern direction has been announced again, may one stop with the announcement, ta pitavam. Thus the Samantha Pasadica passage makes clear that tapiti is used here in the second sense given in the dictionaries, namely in the sense of to stop. If we return to the text of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, it is obvious that the words tapitum vatati mean it is suitable to stop, and what they take up, and that they take up the fact that it is not suitable to stop with the announcement of the markers earlier. Now let us shortly return to the translation of Khanda with insufficient. The present passage describes the manner in which the markers of a sima are to be announced. Thus, here the sequence of the announcement is in the focus, and therefore unjoined would fit the context. But the problem is that Khanda nimitta sima not only refers to a sima where the procedure of the announcement of the markers is incomplete, leaving the markers unconnected, but rather also to a sima which has been determined with objects that are not qualified as markers of a sima by their substance, for example, a coconut tree. Thus, the term Khanda nimitta sima in translation must cover both aspects. If we translated it as a boundary with unjoined markers, it would only fit the scenario described here, but it would not cover the other aspect. This shows that when one translates such a commentary, one has to think about the application of terms in a wider sense, which means a chosen translation must cover all aspects touched by the Pali term, even if the chosen translation does not literally correspond to the Pali word. Our second example comes from the introduction as well. It shows the importance of differentiating between quotations from the root text, which are to be explained, and quotations used in the explanation. On the left side, you have the text without any highlighting for indicating the passages which were quoted from other texts. And on the right side, you have a translation of this text, which runs as follows. When the Uposatha is to be performed by a Sangha that has been addressed in connection with the performance of the observance with the words, what is the Sangha's preliminary duty? And the Sangha should perform the observance, it, the preliminary duty, has been handed down in the text with the words, I prescribe bhikkhus that the Uposatha hall be swept. The problem with this translation is that no attempt was made to verify which parts of the text are quoted from the root text and are thus to be explained here, and which parts may have been quoted from elsewhere within the explanation. Let us look at the text again, this time with the quoted portions highlighted. The references to the text from which they are taken are given in round brackets. We see that the words Kim Sangha Sapupakitcham are quoted from the root text, namely from line 11 of page 4. This sentence is going to be explained here as the sequence of the other catchwords clearly indicates. The subsequent sentence, which also ends with the T, is a quotation too and also comes from the Patimokkha, but it stands 2 lines before the words to be explained here. In addition, there is no and in the text which would connect these 2 quotations as 2 equivalent quotations as assumed in the first translation. Furthermore, after the second quotation, there comes an evam in this manner, and this evam references back. Therefore, the second quotation illustrates something said subsequently to the evam. A third quotation towards the end of this passage is a quotation from the Vinaya. All quoted passages being marked, it is clear that the first indicates what is explained here, whereas the other 2 quotations are used in the explanation. The first of these latter 2 quotations is used to indicate what kind of community Sangha is meant when it comes to discuss the preliminary duty of a Sangha. Since the word Sangha can refer to a variety of Sanghas, it is necessary to make clear that here a local Sangha is meant. This is indicated by characterizing the Sangha as the one who should perform the observance or Uposatha. The second quotation from the Vinaya is quoted in order to show what the preliminary duty of a local Sangha going to perform Uposatha is, namely to sweep the Uposatha house. The text then proceeds to show what the commentary mentioned as a preliminary duty and so forth. I didn't add this because it would have gone too far. So a correct translation of this passage therefore would be, what is the Sangha's preliminary duty means. When the observance shall be performed by a Sangha that has been named in connection with the performance of the observance in this manner, the Sangha should perform the observance, then the Sangha's preliminary duty is that which is handed down in the text, that is in the Vinaya, in the manner beginning with, I prescribe bhikkhus to sweep the Uposatha house. This example shows how important it is to first identify quotations in a text and to verify what kind of quotations these are. Together with the identification of parallels in other texts for a whole text section, such identifications are the most important preliminary duty before one is going to translate a commentary. Our third example is of a completely different nature. It illustrates that the root text needs to be translated in the same sense as the commentator comments on it. The text passage dealt with comes from the commentary to Nissaggiya Partitiya 29, and in our joint translation of the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī by Norman Poot and me, we did not realize that our translation of the root text was not only not in conformity with the commentary, but in addition, simply wrong. The point in focus is the relation of the compound katika punnamam to the rest of the sentence. The text runs as given in the slide. I attach the translation of the entire rule from our Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī translation. Having kept the rains up to the Katika full moon, living in such lodgings as wilderness lodgings, which are considered dangerous, which are frightening, a bhikkhu may, if he wish, deposit one or other of his 3 robes in a house. And should there be some reason for the bhikkhu to live apart from that robe, he is to live apart from that robe for 6 nights at the most. If he should live apart from it for longer than that, unless it is with the permission of the bhikkhus, there is an offense entailing expiation with forfeiture. The problem with this translation of the rule is the translation of the introductory part. Most translators have taken the sequence Upavasam Kopana Katika Punnamam as forming one unit, and thus the full moon of the month of Katika as the temporal endpoint of the rains retreat. Accordingly, they translated, when Vasa is completed up to the full moon in Katika, Oldenburg Rhys-Davids in 1885. Horner in 1914 translated, having spent the rains up to the full moon of Katika, and so on. I don't read all the translations, but it's all in the same sense, including our own translation. Now, all these translations would only make sense if the Katika full moon mentioned here referred to the earlier Katika, that is to the full moon of the month of Asayuja, because then the monks who spend the earlier rains may stay further in their abodes during the month of Katika. But according to the old word commentary in the Vinaya, Katika, full moon in this rule refers to the later Katika. Thus, this full moon would at the same time terminate the rains retreat, the rainy season, and the month of robe donations. The old commentary in the Vinaya does not take the words Upavasam Kopana and Katika Punnamam as one lemma, but explains them separately. Now, if we translate the rule in the manner cited, that is understanding Katika Punnamam as indicating the end of the rains retreat, and if we accept the explanation of the old commentary that Katika Punnama refers to the full moon of Katika, that is the 4th month of the rainy season, then the rule would only be valid for monks who have spent the later rains retreat, because that ends with the full moon of the later Katika. The monks who spend the earlier rains, which is the much more common practice in the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī text, would be excluded from this rule. But in addition, the rule then would not be meaningful at all, because during the rains retreat, the monks wear their rains robe, not the 3 robes. Thus, there is no need whatsoever to regulate the handling of the 3 robes during the month of Katika for those who spend the latter rains, because it would be the 3rd month of their rains retreat and they still would wear their rains robe. The translations therefore cannot be correct if we trust the old word commentary in the Vinaya. Now, when we look into the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, we read the following passage, which has a literal parallel in the Samantha Pasadica. I switch to the translation. In the 9th rule, which refers to the 29th Nissaggiya Partitiya, having kept the rains. This is the quotation from the root text. Here, having kept the rains, upavasam, means having kept the rains, upavasa. Here he gives a different absolutive form. That is to say, having kept the rains, and he gives a 3rd absolutive form upavasitva. For here, the final nasal in the namul absolutive, upavasam, is to be regarded in the same way as in the word upasampacham, having attained, and so on. The meaning is having entered upon the reins and having lived there. And the syntactical connection of this word, namely upavasam, is with the phrase a bhikkhu living in such lodgings. The following is said by this: having entered upon the reins and having lived there, thereafter for the time period ending with the full moon of the later, that is the second Kartika month, living in such lodgings as wilderness lodgings, a bhikkhu may deposit one or other of his 3 robes in a house. From this explanation, it is clear that the Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī understands upavasam as referring to spending the earlier rains, which end with the full moon of the month of Asayuja. The monks then stay in the wilderness lodgings where they had spent the rains retreat until the full moon of Kartika, that is for further 29 days. But in this time period, they are no longer in the rains retreat, and thus they have to again wear their robes. Since living in wilderness lodgings is very demanding, this rule overrides the usual robe rules. Returning to the Patimokkha rule, it is obvious that Kartika Purnamam cannot be understood as the temporal endpoint of upavasam, that is of the monk's rains retreat. It rather must be understood as the temporal endpoint for living in the wilderness lodgings after the rains retreat had been terminated on the full moon of Asayuja. Then Kartika Purnama refers to the full moon of the actual Kartika month, that is the last month of the rainy season, as the old commentary in the Vinaya has it, and as Samantha Pasadica and Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī explain it. We thus have to translate the rule as follows. If having spent the rains, a monk is living in such lodgings up to the full moon of Kartika. This translation would, in addition, match the introductory story in the Vinaya and the pratimokshas of other schools as far as we have them. So this example shows that despite the explanations of all commentaries, scholars did not revise a wrong translation of the root text. It shows how persistent translations can be once they are established. It shows that in translating a Vinaya commentary, one has to rethink the root text as well. And finally, it documents that in order to be able to correctly translate the root text, a thorough knowledge of all other rules connected with the situation covered by that rule is required. I hope that these few examples of what needs to be considered when translating a Vinaya commentary have clarified that careful preparatory work such as identifying parallels, determining quotations, reading the root text in the light of the entire Vinaya regulations and from the perspective of the commentator, avoiding additions to the translation that are not implied by the text, and so on, are preliminary duties to successfully translate a Vinaya commentary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra. Thank you very much. Well, that was a masterful lecture. Yeah. That was really great. Now we still have at least 15 minutes for questions. If there is anyone, I think you can unmute yourself. If not, please let me know through the chat. Is there any question? Oh, I may begin by asking one question that was more or less answered in the lecture, but I would like to know more about your views on that. So why the study of quotations and reused text is so important, and how it can actually affect the understanding of the tradition, and how it has to do with authority, like textual authority, the authority of earlier teachers. Sometimes I understand that there are conflicting testimonies, like there might be older texts and they say different things. So the study of quotations is related to that. How do you see the importance of this study?
I think this is the most important thing, actually. And I said in the lecture that the most important text in all this legal discussion is the Samantha Pasadica. And the main reason for this is that the Samantha Pasadica quotes a lot from the early commentaries, which we don't have any longer. So the first step would be to research all quotations from the Mahapachari, for instance, and all quotations from the Kurundi, and so on, to get a view of what kind of legal interpretations these early commentaries represented. Because if you look in the whole tradition, we often see that the Burmese follow what is taught in the Kurundi, and the Sinhalese what is taught in the Mahapachari. So obviously these early commentaries have traditions which are still there today. And from this point of view, it is not something very old, which is not of interest, but it is very important to study these early commentaries and also to see as how authoritative they were considered. Because we can clearly see that the early commentaries, these Lost Sihalata Kata, is not considered authoritative as a whole and by everybody. So there are traditions which prefer the one or the other one. But the Samantha Pasadica as a text is considered authoritative by nearly all traditions. And the Samantha Pasadica offers all these meanings from these different commentaries, but also adds the one which the author considers relevant. And it may sometimes be from the Mahapachari, sometimes from the Mahaatakata, and so on. And if you go further to the present, then you see that there are, after this Atakata layer, we have all these Gantipada commentaries, and they are not considered as authoritative as the Atakata. And then we have the Tikas, and the question which Tika is considered how authoritative by which tradition is also interesting, because we have three Tikas. One represents a South Indian Sinhalese tradition, one a South Indian tradition, and one a purely Sinhalese tradition. And we can see that the Burmese, for instance, follow partly the South Indian tradition, but not the Sri Lankan tradition. And so far, it is very important to see which texts are quoted with which statements, and how far back these statements go. That means whether this is a new legal interpretation, which it normally is not, or whether it goes back to one of the authors like Samantha Pasadica or Kaṅkhāvitaraṇī, or to the early commentaries. I don't know whether I answered your question, but
yeah, well, that's actually I'm very impressed. That's a lot of information, and it sounds very new to me, at least. I have another question. Since we are here, it's not directly related to this lecture, but indirectly. It has to do with your earlier work, especially your work on your three volumes on the lost Gantipadas that you just mentioned. Because here, most of our students, they are at the MA program, which specializes in philology or the philological pathway. May I ask you to explain a bit more on this project and how it came about, how your interest in lost commentaries or lost works arose, and how you developed that research?
Okay, when I studied in Indology and especially Vinaya, I realized that after the 5th century, there was a big gap. And then we had the Tikas, and the Tikas were dated mostly to the 12th century. So I thought that we have 700 centuries without any discussion of legal questions. How is that possible? And if you look at the Samantha Pasadica and see that the Samantha Pasadica quoted so many texts which were written between the Vinaya and the Samantha Pasadica in these centuries. So I started to look into the Tikas. And the Tika where I found Gantipadas quoted was the oldest one, the Vajra Buddhi Tika. And I started to simply collect the indications of Gantipada quotations. And then I realized that there are really more than 700. And then I started to search for Gantipadas, what that is, because I didn't know it. And I thought that it would be very interesting to look into these quotations to see what they are about. But at that time, we did not yet have the computer files, so the data bank. So I did it in the Burmese edition, I marked them. And then I realized that it is not really possible to see what these quotations are about without looking into all other legal commentaries, because I wanted to see whether some ideas expressed in these Gantipadas survived in the later Tikas or which one were rejected. And then suddenly at some time we got these data banks from Mahidol University and the Chatasangayana CD-ROM. And suddenly it was possible to search all the texts for specific quotations. And this was when I decided that I would like to work on these Gantipadas to find out what they are about and how they are viewed by the later tradition. And this is the reason why I know that the Gantipadas did not have the same authoritative position as the Samantha Pasadica. All the Gantipadas are written after the Samantha Pasadica, and many of them are commentaries to the Samantha Pasadica. They explain difficult words. But what I found out during this study is that most of the Gantipada quotations in the Vajra Buddhi Tika belong to two texts, and one is written by Dhammasiri, and he is a Sinhalese scholar of the probably 6th century. And the other one, the Anugantipada by Vajra Buddhi, probably is written in South India or by someone who is very familiar with the South Indian tradition. And so suddenly the investigation of these Gantipadas revealed that we had during this time between the 5th and 10th century, that we had traditions in South India which differed in interpretation of specific legal questions. And I just realized that some of these opinions of these South Indian Gantipada appeared in the Tika, in the Vimati Vinodani Tika, which was written by a South Indian, but it did not appear in any of the Sinhalese commentaries. And on the other hand, we have the Sinhalese commentaries who have some interpretations and reject the South Indian interpretations. And suddenly it was that the time period, which was a dark age for me when I studied Vinaya, suddenly showed very lively discussions between different traditions. And this South Indian tradition is a Mahavihara tradition too. They say we are really true Mahaviharins and we are very strict, and they are often stricter than the Sinhalese. So this is really highly interesting to watch these commentaries. And I think these black ages which we have are simply because we don't read the text.
Thank you very much. Actually, that's very interesting. If any one of our students is interested in looking at these those 3 volumes, this monograph on the lost Gantipadas, it's in German. You can learn German. It's in our library. So we have the book actually, or the books, the volumes. And Petra, you mentioned several times, and that is very clear from the sheer amount of text that you are mentioning, editions and materials that you are using, that part of your research is based on data analysis or computer data analysis, data banks. I guess you are using transcripts and so on. Could you explain a little bit to us and to our students how you develop your strategies to use these data banks?
Yes, first I must say we have several data banks. The PTS, the Pali Text Society, has made a data bank for the canonical literature a long time ago. I can't use it anymore because it was made for DOS. And so we can't use it nowadays on the present day computers. But since I do not work on the canon that much, it's not a problem for me. Then we had as the next step the Thai data bank, which covered the commentaries and tikas. The problem with this data bank was that we didn't know which editions they took as a basis for the text they presented in the data bank. So it was not clear whether there are changes in these texts, where the redactors changed the text, etc. And then the third is the Chatasangayana CD-ROM, which is the one I use as the primary data bank with which I search. And here I must say there have been some developments in the program. I have the version 3, that is the version they distributed on CD-ROM, and it is the version I used when I started working with these data banks. And I prefer this version over the version 4, which now is online and which is the one you can get now, because of a simple reason. In the version 3, you get the results exactly for what you search. So if I search, for instance, Evam Hoti, then I get only the sequences Evam Hoti. In the version 4, I also get all the sequences of Hoti Evam, which is not what I'm looking for. Right. So I get much more data, and I have to look up all passages, and then I see that 90% are not what I was looking for. So it's a waste of time. That means that I look for words which are not that common, not like Hoti, but I try to find some words which are specific in a sentence. And then I search for these words, and then I look up. I get it presented as canonical references, Atakata references, and Tika references, and then many others. So in the meantime, naturally, I know all these texts and I know to which time they are dated. So if you start with that and you are not familiar or not that familiar with all the data for these texts, it is not bad to make a list for yourself to note the dates so that immediately you know, okay, here these are only grammatical texts of the 13th century where we find a reference, or we have only the very late Sasana Vangsa, for instance, with the reference for a word. But if you start and say you restrict yourself to Atakata and Tika, then it would be useful to look up all references you find. Often you will see that it is the same sentence you find in all the texts because one is copying from the other one. This is the reuse question. And then you see, for instance, you get 15 references for a specific word. And if you look up, it is always the same sentence. So in fact, we have only one reference. That is the reason why you also have to look up all references and not say, okay, I only look at the Atakata also. Okay, then you note that down. And so you proceed with each of the quotations you are discussing. And then in case of this Gantipada thing, for instance, I translated each passage from each text up to the 19th century, to the Pachidyadiyojana, last commentary on the Samantha Pasadica, and looked how the commentators interpreted it. And then you can see the line of development if you're lucky. Sometimes you have boring passages where there is nothing in it or nothing comes out of it, but sometimes you have very interesting passages. And I think this is the way you have to use the data bank, and it is probably, it makes sense to start with a small topic. I think it's much more useful to study the texts oneself in relation to a special topic, a small topic in the beginning, and then to cover all the references, because that's growing anyway. But if you do that, you start to get a really solid knowledge of the legal texts and of what they say, much more than if you read the translation. So many people suggest to read the whole Vinaya or the translation, but I think that is not that useful, because you overread or you read over the problems because you don't realize that there are problems, since you are not so deep in the topic. This is the reason why I suggest to choose something. For instance, to research about the reins rope. What does the Vinaya tell us about the reins rope? What does the Atakata tell us? What the Tika? In that way.
Great. May I ask also, which program do you use for searching?
Yeah, the CD-ROM by the Vipassana Research Institute of Igatpuri, and I have it on. It only works on Windows, and I work with a Mac, So I have a very old laptop which I use for that. And I also recommend to take a CD-ROM version and to search in that, because the online version does not offer reliable results. So when I search the same words online in the version 4, I sometimes get much less references. So I really suggest to ask them for a CD-ROM. They distribute it freely, and to install that on a Windows computer. I think it's XP, which I have on this computer, Windows XP. I don't know whether it works with more recent Windows versions, but it should actually, because they're still distributed. And I think one also could ask them for help if it doesn't work. They have specialists there.
Right, thank you. Is there any question from the students? I think Venerable Tika has his microphone on.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, my question is, it does not concern your topic directly. Yes. But you may know this. You know, in the fourth council, our monastery got 220 in the fourth council. But in our fifth council and sixth council, the monastery code began 227. Do you know this history?
No, I actually, I don't know. It's about the councils, or the time distance of the councils from the Buddha, or I don't know.
Yes, I'm also not quite sure. I heard in the fourth council, the monastery code are 220, but fifth and sixth 227.
So it's about the number of rules in the Patimokkha.
Yes, number of rules. Yes, number of rules.
In the fourth council, it was 220, and in the later councils, 227. Is that right?
Yes, yes, correct. Yes.
Oh, I understand. So no, I didn't hear about that, but it would not surprise me, because all the schools have different numbers of rules, and in the fifth council edition, they changed a lot, and they corrected a lot of things. So this I also have to add. Working with the Chata Sangha in a CD-ROM is only the first step. So the next step would really be to check manuscripts or older editions, also editions from Sri Lanka and Thailand, because they often differ in small things, and they do not have these corrections which the fifth council made. And in order to really get the text how it originally was transmitted, one has to compare all these manuscripts and editions. So, but I didn't know about this change of the numbers. Would be very interested to learn which 7 rules are the new rules. So if you can give me this information, I would be very interested.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Any other question? I think Dr. Anuja, who is here with me, she has a question.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
My question is, you mentioned that Burmese edition follows 2 different traditions, like Sinhali and South Indian.
Yes.
So my question is, do you see any pattern of switching the readings from this tradition to that tradition, or it just miscellaneous, or means there is?
I'm not sure. I think first is that I think that Buddhism probably was introduced, Theravada Buddhism probably was introduced to Burma from South India and not from Sri Lanka. But this only refers to the early times. And in connection with my study of this Balapitiya Sima problem, I realized that there is a switch in Burma. So up to the 12th century, they followed the Sri Lankan version. And then we have the 17th century Vinaya commentary by Tipitaka Lankara. And he suddenly has the interpretation we find in the South Indian tradition, which is also transmitted in the Tika Vimati Vinodani Tika, 13th century. And I think the point is that the Burmese very much used this Vimati Vinodani Tika. And Tipitaka Lankara, when he wrote his commentary, he used all three tikas. So he quotes from the Vajrabuddhi Tika, from the Saratadipani, and from the Vimati Vinodani Tika. But he also adds new information which is relevant for Burma in the 17th century. And for that, he takes as a basis mostly the Vimati Vinodani Tika. And this commentary had a very, I think for Burma, it is a very important commentary. So younger traditions look up this commentary, and this is the reason why in 19th century, the Burmese Sangha he decided in this case, in this Sima case of Sri Lanka, he decided on the basis of this Vimati Vinodani Tika description. And the Sinhalese then said, yes, but this is not what we say. Our tradition has a different opinion on that, and they discuss from their texts, which are not published, and so nobody had them at hand, only the Sinhalese in their monastic libraries. So I think this is the reason, and we also can see that in 19th century, the monks between Burma, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, there were many contacts, and they visited each other, and they exchanged texts. And so you can see that this tradition of Burma also comes to Thailand. Also, Thailand has the South Indian tradition suddenly, and Sri Lanka is the only tradition which keeps the Sinhalese tradition. But this is not known, and you will not find that in secondary literature, because nobody looked at these small things which hint at such a South Indian tradition. There is no mention of that. But in the texts, if you read them and if you look at small things here, like methods of determining the Sima, then you can see how this switches and how this develops. And we have in Burma in 15th century, the Kalyani inscription by King Dhammachetti, and he read all the tikas and he mentions them, he lists them. And he said, we do it as the Sinhalese do. And so you can see between the 15th and 17th century, there was this switch from Sinhalese to South Indian tradition. But why exactly and who was responsible for this, I don't know. I think we have to read still more texts which were written in between, which you do not know yet, which are not edited, on which we possibly have in manuscripts.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Petra. I think the time is up. If there is no more questions, I think no one is asking anything, and the time is up. Venerable Tika, is there anything else you would like to ask?
No question, but I want to have when we read this translation, sometimes we pound some different thing, or Pasadica and your translation, something like that. Actually, I want to help you by looking at our translation, Burmese translation.
Yeah, I'm not good in Burmese. I studied that for 2 semesters only, so I'm not fluent in reading it.
Yes, sometimes honestly, I want to have it. I want to help you by reading our Burmese translation. I want to correct your translation. I want to put something you need, something like that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, if I have time, I want to help you.
Yes, this would be very great. I would be thankful for that.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for attending this lecture. And special thanks to Dr. Petra Kieffer-Pülz from Weimar in Germany for teaching us this masterful lecture on translating Vinaya texts today. We hope to have her in the future at SSBU. Yeah. And for now, you all stay safe and stay well, and we'll meet again next semester, hopefully. Wait a second, I think Ph.D. wants to say something.
I just want to say thank you. It was very interesting. Thank you so much. Yeah, very good lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that you're not bored, because that
we were 3 here using the same washing, so I think more people joined than you can see actually.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm glad if there was of use.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you too.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Petra, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Aleix.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Aleix, for this. Thank you.